Welcome back to the McIntyre Report. We're here talking with Chris Davies, Conservative commentator out of the UK. Chris, very interesting what's happening there. We've been talking about Starmer. Nigel Farage, Nigel Farage on part of the Global Economic Forum, you would have just seen then on the ad break, he's been invited to maybe head that up. But Nigel Farage, Elon Musk seems to think, and others, that he has the possibility of becoming the next UK Prime Minister. What's your thoughts on Nigel?
He's had a very interesting 24 hours. On the one hand, he's attracted Dame Andrea Jenkins, who's now going to stand for one of the mayor elections in one of the counties in England, who was a relatively heavy hitter within the Conservative Party. But on the other hand, he's lost Ben Habib, who was deputy leader under Richard Tice before Farage took over the leadership prior to the general election. And Ben is not going to go quietly. He's very unhappy with how reform is structured in terms of Nigel owning still 60% of the voting shares in the limited company. He's also unhappy with the drift in relation to immigration controls. So it's been a mixed day for Nigel, but there's no question about it. Looking at the latest opinion polling, Reform are polling at 22%, which is a high for them. They're only 5 points behind the Tories and only 3 points behind Labour. Right. So on balance, you'd have to say that they are doing relatively well.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Australia and in other countries in the West, people want to see a political revolution. I launched Independent Media, the Australian National Review 11 years ago, because I thought by now I predicted there would be a massive demand for people wanting the truth, really, that they realize that mainstream media has been lying to them, and the puppet governments in the West were basically a vassal state of the globalist agenda, sadly. But is it possible for a credible third party to come to power? I think it appears that Nigel Farage has that possibility, or was close to being able to do something with that. Do you think his strategy with, I think it's GB News that he owns or is a part of, is that critical, you think, having your own media platform? Because if you look in Australia, Australian politics, as an example, we have Fairfax and we used to have Murdoch, effectively. We still have Murdoch on the right. So Murdoch supports the right and Fairfax is left-wing news. So you have two major media empires, and that puts Labor in power, or puts the coalition in Australia, or the Liberals as we call them, or the equivalent of Republicans in America. Or Conservatives, I think you guys call them. So I think that maybe, what do you think of that strategy, what he's doing? Because without a media platform, your chance of getting a political party into power seems to be non-existent.
Nigel is the consummate professional when it comes to, shall we say, getting the media to do his bidding. He's on a very, very good gig at GB News. He gets paid a handsome amount of money for a primetime presenting slot in their roster. He is also excellent at media presentations. He rarely uses notes, if ever. He can talk quite candidly, and he can stay on message. And I suspect that in the latter days of the presidential run-up, that Trump was probably counselled on that by Farage, because Trump did have a habit, as you probably know, of drifting off message, whereas Farage is like a laser. He's really good at it. I think the concern that I've got, which I'll go back to, is that he's got the ability to be a bit of a flip-flop when it comes down to it. And my concern with reform, with the departure of Ben Habib and one or two others antagonising, is that, yes, they have got the potential, there's no question about it, to break through and become the second, possibly even the leading party in British politics at the next election. But they do need to have a set of values and principles. And that's one area where, shall we say, Nigel has some flexibility. He, on the one hand, had previously ruled out mass deportations. He's now begun to soften his stance on that and say that he would consider mass deportations. And people are looking for guidance. They are looking for leadership, and they're looking for consistency. And we are living in a post-truth era in this country. And the reality is, mass deportations need to be on the agenda. The Conservatives produced their latest material around immigration today, but after 14 years in power, frankly, nobody believes them. Labour have no interest whatsoever in stopping the boats, in tackling immigration and all of the impacts of immigration on the United Kingdom. So there is a huge opportunity for reform and other parties on the right to come through. But there does need to be more honesty, more transparency, and a bit more policy, frankly.
So with the immigration, I guess a lot of people also don't realize it's, when you see that that's also what's happening to Britain and the UK, it's another globalist strategy. Why do you think they are flooding the West? What's your view on why they're flooding the West with mass immigration, often poor quality immigration?
Well, I refer to it as garbage immigration. It is a lot easier for employers to employ people on the minimum wage who can barely speak English but can ride a motorcycle and deliver food than it is to actually train the indigenous population and pay them properly. A huge amount is made over here of GDP as opposed to GDP per capita. GDP per capita is falling in the United Kingdom. It's been falling for the last 2 years. The country is getting poorer, but everybody focuses on GDP. Well, of course, the more people you bring in, the more GDP you will produce, but the less GDP per capita. As a result of, and I'll use the term quite happily, garbage immigration. You'll have seen a rewriting of the immigration figures for the last couple of years that showed that in 2023, net migration to the United Kingdom was at 906,000 people. We're an island. Now, okay, you're an island, but it's fair to say you've got rather more landmass than we have. And now Australia's got its own problems with immigration. It's got its own problems with social media, it would seem. But one thing you have got that we don't have is a substantial landmass. We now have over 70 million people living on this island, and our infrastructure and public services are crumbling under the weight. We're spending over 5 billion a year now in housing illegal immigrants who, frankly, should never be allowed to get here in the first place. And there is no question. Farage tried to make the 24 general election the immigration election. In 2029, assuming there's a country left worthy of the name, it will be all about immigration, because by then the population could be up as high as 75 million, and public services, the NHS, the so-called vaunted NHS, which is falling apart at the seams, and our other infrastructure services just will not be coping. I cannot see, even with a majority of 170 seats, Labour remaining in office for their full term.
Yeah, well, certainly I can only imagine by 2029, if they remain that long, the damage to Britain, it would be probably a very sad state of affairs. So hopefully something will change before then. Not just in Britain, of course, in the West in general. Now, obviously, Britain is sending Storm missiles to Ukraine. They're very outspoken. I mean, from an outsider's view, it looks like Britain is a former global empire, but certainly isn't anymore.
No.
I've heard stats that it would last literally 2 weeks in a war with Russia with the amount of ammunitions it has. But they're talking a big talk as if they're still a superpower and poking a nuclear superpower in Russia that actually is still a military superpower. Why do you think they're doing this, or Starmer, etc.? What's the agenda, you think?
Well, it's stupid. To send Storm Shadow missiles into Russia was an unneeded and unnecessary escalation. I can only believe that in the dying days of Biden's presidency, he's tapped up Starmer and said, come on, we're going to send some of ours. We need you to send some of yours and allow this to go. Putin has reacted thus far proportionately. He's targeted Ukrainian power infrastructure rather than actually firing missiles back into NATO. He's not stupid enough prior to Trump coming into office to want to escalate the war beyond the Ukraine-Russia border. But you're right, this is a nuclear power. And the difference between Putin and the likes of Starmer and Biden is political will. You don't keep power in Russia for 24 years, nearly 25 years, by being lightweight. These folks have got absolutely no compass, no direction, no moral rectitude whatsoever. Whereas Putin has at his disposal a fantastic armory. He's got nuclear weapons and he's not afraid to use them. And ultimately, if never mind the United Kingdom lasting 2 weeks in a war, it would not last 2 minutes in a war with the Russians. We would be left completely denuded. There'd be nothing left of this country. So it is time to accept the reality of where we are. We don't even spend anywhere near the level that we should be on defense. We have an army now that is half the size that it should be. We don't even have ships in our navy that are now, flights to take off and come back to them. We are a denuded country when it comes to our military presence. And it's time that, frankly and honestly, we got out of a war in Ukraine that has enriched many, but certainly is not going to enrich the United Kingdom citizenry.
Yes, Chris, I think that's well said. I mean, it's crazy how far, I mean, the British Navy, the British military years ago used to be something to be proud of, but now it's, I don't know whether the British people realize how much the leadership in Starmer is putting them at risk. I mean, it's true, if Putin wasn't a sensible, intelligent, restrained leader, he would have every right to lob one missile back at London and say, keep doing this and I'll keep sending them back. And of course, the West would be outraged and Putin would be the worst person in the world, which they make out he is anyhow. So I think we're very lucky that with the leadership of China, Chinese President Putin, even the Iranian leadership, show an enormous amount of restraint against NATO, which we really know is a wannabe one world government army. But I think it's certainly well overdue. We don't need NATO, and I don't think we need British leadership trying to escalate World War III. Thanks for your time, Chris. We appreciate what's going on there in Britain and your insights on that. We'll talk to you some other time on the McIntyre Report.